Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Selesnow, Senior Advisor with Jobs for the Future, and I'd like to welcome you to today's national conversation on the 80th anniversary of the National Apprenticeship Act of 1937, also called the Fitzgerald Act. During today's conversation, we will explore the rich history of apprenticeship in the United States, highlight successes of key leaders and programs, focus on recent innovations, and look towards apprenticeships of the future. We are joined today by an outstanding panel of guests and speakers, including Robert Lerman. Bob is a fellow at the Urban Institute and leads the American Institute for Innovative Apprenticeships. We're also joined today in another panel with Karen Morgan, Director of the Bureau of Apprenticeship for the great state of Wisconsin, Greg Chambers, the Director of Compliance and Apprenticeships at Oberg Industries in Fairport, Pennsylvania, Dan Marshall, the Executive Director of the Working for America Institute of the AFL-CIO, and John Ladd, who most of you know, Administrator of the Office of Apprenticeship at the United States Department of Labor. Since Wisconsin created the first state registered apprenticeship system in 1911 and Congress enacted the National Apprenticeship Act in 1937, much has changed in the National Apprenticeship system. There are more workers and more businesses engaged. Secondary and post-secondary institutions are more involved than ever before in the training and related technical instruction, and apprenticeship is now a more widely accepted pathway to the middle class. What hasn't changed, however, are the fundamentals of apprenticeship: on-the-job work experience, coupled with related training and instruction, with close supervision and mentoring on the job, which produces strong results for both workers and employers. So let's begin our conversation today. We're going to start off with Robert Lerman. Bob is a fellow at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. and directs the American Institute for Innovation and Apprenticeship. Bob is known nationally and internationally as an expert in apprenticeship, has written numerous articles and research studies, and we're thrilled to have Bob Lerman here today.
So Bob, I guess my first question is, so here we are celebrating and recognizing the 80th year of the National Apprenticeship Act of 1937. So you've been around a long time, looking at the system, interested in some of your thoughts. How's it been used? How's it changed over the years? So what are some of your thoughts about this 80th anniversary of this legislation?
Well, I wasn't around in 1937 to observe the process, but if you look at it, it was partly the outgrowth of interest in vocational education more broadly. It was partly the effort to provide rights to the apprentices, where there was very uneven notion of apprenticeship, and some states began passing laws concerning apprenticeship. Wisconsin was the first, and the federal law is actually quite brief. It really calls for the secretary to bring together employers, labor, and government generally. It doesn't really emphasize the interaction between schools and apprenticeship. But the second thing that's noteworthy is that it came out of the National Youth Administration, so there was a youth dimension to it. But it was a way of having a federal regulatory role in apprenticeship, and that's really been kind of improvised over the years. The absence of any amendments up until, let's say, the 2008 regulations, in one way is an indication that no one in government felt that the government should play that large a role. The Office of Apprenticeship, which used to be the Bureau of Apprenticeship and Training, that office played a key role, and one of the key elements that emerged in the late 60s and early 70s with the civil rights movement was an effort to try to help minorities get into apprenticeships. So that was really the long-term view up until, I would say, the late 1980s, early 1990s, when people began to look again at some of the European models of apprenticeship. The German Marshall Fund took a number of governors over to Germany to look at the apprenticeship system and a few tried to develop their programs. That led to President George H.W. Bush proposing the National Youth Apprenticeship Act of 1992. And then when Bill Clinton entered the White House, he liked apprenticeship, and out of that grew the National School to Work Opportunities Act of 1994. Unfortunately, apprenticeship began to play a smaller role in that school to work legislation. Meanwhile, the Office of Apprenticeship was losing staff and considered somewhat of a backwater to other Labor Department training programs.
Bob, when you look, looking back, that's a great history, thanks. But given all of the activity in the apprenticeship over the last 3 years, just to continue your thread, the Obama administration did some major investments and set some goals over the last 3 years. The Trump administration has indicated some interest in continuing and expanding apprenticeship. So that's all good news for the apprenticeship system. I think it's good news for the American worker and the American employer. But given all the activity the last 3 years, where do you think we are today in the context of the Act? Where do you think apprenticeship is today? There is some growth in new industries. Is that overstated? Is that happening? Is the quality still good? I mean, the Apprenticeship Act did allow for the registration and some quality control there. And then lastly, what do you see some challenges? So is it growing? Is it still high quality?
It is growing. I think it's high quality. Now we're at a point where the question is not why apprenticeship. I think we're gaining a lot of adherence to apprenticeship. They're seeing some of the problems in what I call the academic-only approach and the pure college approach to careers. We're now entering a phase of how to do it. But with apprenticeship, you need an employer, and you need to get them to offer apprenticeships. And how to do that is a huge challenge, because American employers, by and large, are not really familiar with registered apprenticeship. So I think there are now efforts to simplify, to do better at marketing. And as we learn from experience and learn from other models in England and elsewhere, I think we will move the agenda forward. I think the next 2 or 3 years are key to expanding into other industries, and there is some expansion. It's still relatively small compared to other countries, but I think we have a great opportunity right now.
2 final questions for you, Bob. One is just for a short answer, and then I'll get to my last one. So the National Apprenticeship Act, which is very brief, as you noted, out there today, does that provide the framework in and of itself to move forward and expand additional apprenticeships?
Well, the National Apprenticeship Act and actually the 2008 regulations, which increased the emphasis on competency-based models. Unlike other countries, we don't have skill frameworks that cover particular occupations for the nation as a whole. And I think as we move more in that direction, we'll see a much greater take-up of apprenticeship.
So, we know that the building trades have a long and rich history and have figured out apprenticeship without much government assistance. But as we look towards the future, where do you think apprenticeship is heading? What suggestions do you have for encouraging more employers and then even educators or policymakers to engage more in apprenticeship and sort of take it to scale?
My first suggestion is to mount major marketing efforts, both at the leadership level, governors, even the president, and then have a system for marketing to individual firms. This along with these competency-based broad frameworks. But then, in addition, I think we need to allow for the funding, wherever we have funding for career-focused education and training, give apprenticeship the same opportunity. So if we can do both of those, have some broader funding, have a huge marketing initiative, I think we can move the apprenticeship agenda. And I believe once we see more and more examples, it will build on itself and create a kind of momentum that can lead us to scale.
All right, so thank you, Bob Lerman, Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute and Director of the American Institute for Innovative Apprenticeships. Thank you for your observations. You're quite the historian on apprenticeship, and we appreciate your comments. We do realize you weren't around in 1937 when the act was signed, but we do appreciate your observations and your historical perspective nonetheless. Thank you, Bob.
So now we will move on to our next and final panel of the afternoon, where I'll be joined shortly by John Ladd, the Director of Apprenticeship at the U.S. Department of Labor, Karen Morgan, the Director of the Bureau of Apprenticeship in Wisconsin, Greg Chambers, an employer, Director of Compliance from Oberg Industries, and Dan Marshall from AFL's CIO's Working for America Institute. So I think we'd like to go first over to Wisconsin, the great state of Wisconsin, and welcome Karen Morgan, the Director of Apprenticeship in Wisconsin. So first start out with you. You know, Wisconsin was the first state to pass legislation on apprenticeship in 1911, I believe it was. So Karen, I'd like to welcome you and ask you to get some of your thoughts as you look back on the 80 years, actually more than that in Wisconsin, the 80 years plus of apprenticeship, and some of your reflections on that. Karen?
Okay, thank you, Eric. In looking back at the history of apprenticeship in Wisconsin, back in 1911, a group of Wisconsin economists were concerned about the industrial sector in the state of Wisconsin and the lack of training. So they did a European tour and looked at the apprenticeship programs in Europe. And when they came back to Wisconsin, they actually worked with the legislature and developed the nation's first registered apprenticeship. So as we look forward from 1911 and look what's happening in this century now, much of the same studying is going on with the registered apprenticeship program as various states and the USDOL making visits to Europe to see what is happening in Europe and bringing those good ideas back to the United States and ultimately to the states in the United States. And so the 80th anniversary, I think, is offering us the opportunity to reflect on that, to see what modifications have been made to the European system that can benefit us here in the United States and improve our rules and regulations, and more importantly, our training that we're doing under apprenticeship here in the United States.
Very interesting, Karen. Thank you very much. How interesting it was for me to learn that we were going to Europe even back in the early part of the 1900s to learn and borrow from the European system like we do today. And even though we're not going to become the European system in the U.S., there's plenty to learn from Germany, Switzerland, and other countries who have been doing this for a long time. So, Karen, as you look towards where apprenticeship is today in Wisconsin and even across the U.S. from your perspective, are we advancing in apprenticeship? Are we staying with traditional industries? Are we getting into new industries and new occupations? What are some of your observations or where you think apprenticeship is today and perhaps where it's headed?
Well, several years ago, Wisconsin began experience skilled worker shortage. And there were a lot of ideas floating around in the state of Wisconsin about how to improve Wisconsin's apprenticeship system. And so we formed a consortia of all of our traditional apprenticeship partners, but then we brought in folks that had not been involved in apprenticeship in Wisconsin. We brought in the workforce system. We brought in our university system. We brought in our economic development system, and started talking about apprenticeship and where there might be some gaps in the training. And so it was from that summit or that consortia meeting that we had that we were able to start working on modernizing our apprenticeship program. Coupled with that began the partnership with USDOL as they were looking at the same thing on a national level. So Wisconsin was able to participate in some of the grant opportunities for registered apprenticeship that DOL put forth, and we were lucky to receive a couple of grants. And so we're carrying out many of the ideas and recommendations that came out of that summit, which included looking at exercising different models under 2929 that we had not, but more importantly, bringing in new industries. And that has been very, very successful. As we look at information technology, we're looking at healthcare, we're looking at financial services, all areas where structured technical training is needed, and apprenticeship is able to fill that gap to employers that work in those industry areas.
So certainly a lot of these new and emerging partnerships that you're developing, not only with your workforce partners throughout Wisconsin, but with new and emerging industries. I imagine some of these programs or projects were never even envisioned by the writers of the National Apprenticeship Act, but all of these programs are still under registered apprenticeship and meeting the general spirit of the National Apprenticeship Act. Is that fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. Going back to the original law in Wisconsin, the legislature stated 3 purposes of the Wisconsin apprenticeship law: to provide industries with skilled labor, to provide career opportunities for youth, and to protect individuals who enter apprenticeships. And so as we look at our modern-day apprenticeship program, that is what our major goals are as it relates to the expansion of apprenticeship. And you think of those 3 things and how important they are, but more importantly, how relevant they are to the initiatives that we're taking nationwide under registered apprenticeship today. So let's see. So that's how we have been able to modernize, continue to bring in new industries, and most importantly, update as industry demands.
So, Karen, as you think about that sort of transition of the last few years, and I know that Wisconsin has done a lot of work in youth apprenticeships as well, and has a very robust program for engaging high school youth in apprenticeships. But as you look towards the future of apprenticeship under the National Apprenticeship Act, or whatever the form it takes over the next few years, we know there's a few changes that are being proposed to the system. But what do you see as the future of apprenticeship in Wisconsin and maybe more broadly across the country? Do you think more industries will be using it? And what are some of your thoughts and where you'd like to see it go?
Well, with the grants that we receive for registered apprenticeship from USDOL, we have been able to work with employers who are out of our traditional apprenticeship programs, and they are astounded about the value of registered apprenticeship, how agile it is, and how relevant it is to their training needs within their organizations. The whole idea that the apprentice, for example, from day one has the job, so they have that individual to begin training from that day. Instead of bringing in people and doing in-house training or other types of training, they value having that individual, and more importantly, the support they get from us as the registration agency, and also the support they get from Wisconsin's technical college system, which is an important partner in Wisconsin's apprenticeship program.
Great. And what do you think for the future? Do you think there's more companies are going to engage? Have you seen a take up in under the apprenticeship system? And do you have good thoughts about expansion in the future?
Absolutely. I think what the grants have allowed us to do is to get our foot in the door and start spreading the information about apprenticeship and getting the structure set up in our non-traditional programs. In the future, we will have that structure in place. We will have our champions in place in the various industries. So therefore, I envision our new industries operating as much and as robust as our traditional apprenticeship programs, certainly manufacturing. We have a lot of programs in the utility industry, and I see that same thing happening with IT. I see the same thing happening with financial services. And the great part about that is our interaction with industry in the state of Wisconsin allows us to react rather quickly to changes that are made in the industries. We have ongoing employer groups or industry groups that advise us on how to continually modernize those apprenticeship programs. And that is how Wisconsin has stayed relevant to industry in Wisconsin. We've always had a lot of support from our legislature, from our governor's office, and I envision this going on as we respond to industry needs. So the future, in my mind, looks very bright in the state of Wisconsin as we bring in more and more employers and additional sectors where they have intense training needs.
Great, Karen. Thank you very much. Well, Wisconsin certainly has been a leader in more ways than one, going back to 1911, and continues to be so today and continues to expand and grow. So, Karen, thanks for your thoughts. We'll be getting back to you in a couple of minutes, but I want to thank you for those observations from the great state of Wisconsin. Let's move over to the great state of Pennsylvania. I'd like to welcome Greg Chambers from Oberg Industries. Greg is the Director of Compliance with Oberg. And Greg, welcome to the call today. We appreciate you as an employer participating in this. And I guess my first question is, tell us a little bit about Oberg Industries and how long you've been engaged in apprenticeship work at Oberg.
Good afternoon, Eric. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to the audience. Oberg is an employee-owned company. We've been in business about 70 years. We're a medium-sized company, and our whole specialty is tight tolerance work. So the thing about Oberg that most people marvel at is that we hold tolerances down to millionths of an inch, but we don't require any kind of formal experience or training before you come in the door. We rely totally on our apprenticeship system to develop our people. So literally you're brought in knowing nothing, and when you are done with your apprenticeship, you can hold tolerances to thousandths and millionths of an inch.
So that precision work is pretty important in your industry, I'm sure. Can you tell us a little bit about how and when Oberg decided to get into apprenticeships and use that as a workforce training strategy, which apparently has served you all quite well?
Well, at Oberg, we don't have a product of our own. We sell skill. So our customers are the people in the industries that either can't produce a product economically or they can't hold the tolerances. So we work to print, and we work based on our customers' desires. So we sell our skill. So literally, the apprenticeship program and our graduates of the program are what our products have. That's our competitive advantage. So we've been around 70 years. We've had an apprenticeship program for 40 years, a registered apprenticeship program for 40 years. And without that, we cannot find the people that we need, because literally, if you look at society, that's going counterculture to what we need. You don't develop basic physics skills anymore. You don't even have the opportunity, Eric, to develop them. I mean, think about how many times you've worked on your car recently, or how many times you fix things. Society as a whole has gone to repair and replace. So if something goes wrong, you pull it out, whether it's a module or something else, and you throw it away. You don't tinker anymore. You don't fix things. So where do you learn those basic physics skills and those basic mechanical skills of levers and gears? You just have no opportunity to do it. So we got to develop that in our apprenticeship program, because that's not even taught in the schools anymore.
Mm-hmm. So for 40 years, Oberg has been doing registered apprenticeships in the U.S.
Yes.
Yes, and do you know roughly how many apprentices have gone through over the years? I'm sure you don't have that in your back pocket, but I would imagine you have fair numbers of apprentices.
Yes, we've graduated over 500 graduates of our apprenticeship program. Not only have we graduated 500 people in our program, but we've also been the origin for the startup of over 20 different companies in our area. So all of the companies that are we call them our children, they have registered apprenticeship program, and they just carry on a tradition.
And what was it about establishing the registered apprenticeship program? Was it the quality you were looking for? I mean, companies have choices whether they want to register a program with the state or the Department of Labor, or whether they want to create some other sort of workforce training program. What was it about registering with Department of Labor that appeals to Oberg today?
Well, for us, the degree of difficulty and the high degree of precision that's needed, products today aren't getting any easier. The easy work's already in Mexico or in Asia, but the harder the product, those are the ones that are staying domestic. So your skill level has to be continually increasing. You also have to deal with a lot of disruptive new technology. Even in advanced manufacturing, the machines that were used just 20 years ago, Eric, are no longer used due to automation and computer numerical control. So literally, you got to always be training your people. You have to have a process in place within your company if you want to have organizational agility, if you want to keep in alignment with the customer and be responsive to your customers. You have to have a process in place that'll turn your employees around in a dime. And you got to make sure that it's completely aligned with what's needed that day. Yesterday's gone. Last year's product isn't what's accepted. If you think about even your cell phones, you're expecting a new product out in 6 to 8 months. So as a company in advanced manufacturing, we have to always be ahead of the curve. So in our apprenticeship program, we're teaching our apprentices things today that won't even be in existence until tomorrow. So we're always ahead of the curve and being ready.
So clearly, the National Apprenticeship Act has served Oberg well for the last 40 years of developing some pretty high-quality programs under the Act. As you talk to your, I'll call them family members, but as you talk to other companies in your area, small and medium-sized companies and large companies, where do you see the future of apprenticeship going in this country? Greg, you've been pretty involved, in some national meetings and connections on apprenticeship, but locally and regionally in Pennsylvania, where do you see apprenticeship going, and what are some of your thoughts as you look to the future?
I think going forward, Eric, the apprenticeship is the model that's going to be the norm pretty soon. If you need any kind of really in-depth connection between intellectual capacity and physical ability, you're going to have to do it through an apprenticeship program, even though most educational institutions have somewhat of a lean apprenticeship program. They have lecture and they have lab, or they have theory and practicum. Still, you got to make sure that alignment between intellectual capacity and physical ability is refined and strengthened. If not, the best analogy I can give you, Eric, think about an athlete or an athletics. As you get old, you still have the knowledge, you still have the data, you still have the understanding of the theory, but what starts to fail is that connection to the physical capabilities. So you still know how to play the game, your body just won't listen to you anymore. But literally in an apprenticeship program, that's where the power is. You give them the knowledge, you give them the data, you give them the theory, but you also refine the physical aspect so they can apply that well and they can apply it efficiently. We have a model here at Oberg. We want to do it right and then do it fast. And speed is the name of the game if you're dealing with industry and anything out there in the real world, because first the market and costs are all hinged on speed. So you want to have your apprenticeship program hinged on speed just as well as the customers are. That's one of the failings in the educational system, is that they have kids doing projects in CTCs, but they don't tie speed into it. So it might take them a whole semester to do it. In the real world, that's not going to cut it.
Right. So that on the job, real world experience is helpful. My last question to you, Greg, is this: one of the, as I said earlier in the call, one of the tenets of the National Apprenticeship Act was to look out for the welfare of apprentices. And as you walk around your plants and your partners and talk to apprentices, what are some of their observations about being participants in your program? It sounds like a rigorous, high-quality program. What do you think your apprentices are saying about apprenticeship and the National Apprenticeship Act?
Well, we've had to change with the times too, Eric. So no longer do we just give journey worker papers, but we give them industry credentials. We give them college certificates. So literally, our apprentices have a whole portfolio that is portable and travels with them. So if they ever leave Oberg and start up their own company or go to a competitor, the competitor knows exactly what they can do. So when we hire new people, if they have industry credentials or journey worker certificates, we automatically give them advanced standing. That's critical. So you want to make sure your pay is tied to the ability of your employee. So the better grasp you have on the abilities of your employee, the more fair you can set up your compensation system. So our apprentices love the fact that we have an apprenticeship system because they know exactly what they're going to be making based on what they can do.
Outstanding. So for 40 years, Oberg Industries has been participating in the National Apprenticeship Act under a registered apprenticeship program. It sounds like it's working out well for the employer, but also working out for the apprentices that are lucky enough and fortunate enough to participate in your program, Greg. So we'll be getting back to you shortly, and we'll move on to our next panelist today. Thanks, Greg, so much. So let's move down the line, and we'll head to Washington, D.C. now and talk with our friend John Ladd, the administrator of the Office of Apprenticeship at the U.S. Department of Labor. John, welcome. And, you have sort of a unique view in D.C. and a national view, and you've been doing this work for a while at the Department of Labor, overseeing the National Apprenticeship System. What are some of your reflections on the 80th and the National Apprenticeship Act? And, the last 80 years, I know you haven't been there for 80, but would like to get some of your reflections as we recognize the 80th anniversary of the Act. John?
Great. Thanks, Eric. Hi, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity. I think a couple things come to mind, as I think about the Act. And, I was here when we celebrated the 75th, here when we celebrated the 70th. So, it's exciting to see the continued interest in apprenticeship and the legacy that this Act has had. But, I think two things really jump to mind right off the bat. I think one is the simplicity of the Act itself. It's hard to imagine today that laws were passed and the National Apprenticeship Act is about one page. It's very simple, and some of the things that have already been mentioned here before and Karen had mentioned, really focuses us on three major areas. It directed DOL to cooperate with states. It directed DOL to develop standards with industry, and as has been mentioned before, really positions the Department of Labor's responsibility in protecting the safety and welfare of apprentices. So it's those three simple concepts, and you saw that echoed in Wisconsin's law as well, really form the basis of the federal role here, the public role in apprenticeship. And it's a simple idea, but it's a powerful idea and one that stood the test of time. There's been very few changes to the National Apprenticeship Act since it was passed in 1937. So again, unlikely that you see that many laws stand for that long, essentially unchanged. And, you think about the impact that the Act has had over the past 80 years. The system has grown. I think at the time there were about 4,000 apprentices that were in the system. There's now over 500,000 apprentices. And, there's well over 100,000 individuals that start an apprenticeship each year. And so when you start doing the math and you think about the millions of individuals that have been impacted by apprenticeship, the families that many of these apprentices are supporting, the communities that they're part of, we're really talking about transformational opportunities where people get this opportunity to participate in these kinds of careers, earn a family-sustaining wage, build their careers, and then pass those legacies on to their children and spread those benefits throughout their communities. it's really powerful and really humbling to think about the impact that this one act has had over the past 80 years.
So John, as you've been in that office for a while, as you said, and as you look at things today, right? There was the apprenticeship system in this country has fits and starts, right? The Apprenticeship Act was passed 80 years ago, and there's been some not modifications. I think that's a very interesting point that the Act has stayed simple and true for many, many years. There's state partners that you have at state apprenticeship agencies. There's other states that your staff serves. But as you look at the national view, where do you see, the previous administration did major investments in work in apprenticeship in the last 3 years. The current administration is again looking at strengthening the apprenticeship system. How do you see things now? Is it expanding? Karen talked a little bit about this, but from your national perch, where do you see the expansion, the opportunities, and growth in apprenticeship in the U.S.?
Yeah, and absolutely. I think we're seeing tremendous growth in pretty much all dimensions of apprenticeship itself. Ultimately, it's about having more individuals who have those opportunities to get access to these jobs and apprenticeship opportunities. It's about growing into new industries. But I think it's also been, just really exciting to watch new players, new stakeholders, new entities get involved, that hadn't really played a major role in apprenticeship for a large part of its history. As I think most people know, apprenticeship had been fairly concentrated in the construction industry for most of its history. And, with efforts like what we're seeing in Wisconsin and other places, we really see not only this expansion into new industry, but new players, community colleges, the workforce system, other intermediaries stepping in, playing a role, that really builds that bridge between the employers or across employers, makes it easier for industries to start apprenticeship programs. But we have a much more robust ecosystem around apprenticeship today than I think we did, even a few years ago, and I think that's going to continue to grow. And I think that's a mark of the health of the system, that there are more players, more entities, more kinds of organizations getting involved in not only directly providing apprenticeship, but helping to support employers, again, to aggregate that demand, to make it easier, to provide technical assistance, to provide better quality. There's lots of roles that DOL and our state partners can play, but there's lots of room for other players to play in really helping to grow and improve the quality of programs in the system itself.
Well, I think that's a great observation, John, and I'm sure the framers, if that's the right word, of the act, we're not aware of, state and local workforce boards, the community college participation, the growth and some of the innovations in the traditional organized labor programs that have really sort of stepped up to do some great innovations in delivering of technical training and really advanced technical training. So there's a lot more people in the game. So are we in a period of transition? Is it coming together? Do we have a lot more work to do? And what do you think the future will bring, both for the national apprenticeship system and just apprenticeship in general?
Sure. Well, of course, as everyone I'm sure knows, the president recently signed an executive order on apprenticeship, which is really remarkable when you think about it, because part of that executive order states pretty clearly that is the policy of the United States to expand high-quality apprenticeship opportunities. That's an incredible statement to think about, and particularly for those who've been involved in apprenticeship for many, many years. And, there were certainly times when apprenticeship did not have that kind of visibility and attention. So, there's lots of details still to be worked out with regard to implementing that executive order. But this is a sea change in positioning apprenticeship, as Greg mentioned, as really, the standard, the default way for people to enter the workforce. So I think, while we're working out those details, I think some things are pretty clear. We're going to see more and more apprenticeship directly aligned and embedded in education, and we already see that today where, and Greg mentioned it as well, where apprentices are walking away with college credit or college degrees. That's going to become more the norm. We're going to see many more models and different partnership structures. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to how you do apprenticeship. It's going to look different in different industries, and we want to encourage that innovation. We're going to see more partners, more players get involved, as we've already mentioned, really kind of expanding that ecosystem and support for apprenticeship. And, I think overall, just more flexibility, more innovation. I think that's going to be the name of the game as these new industries adopt and embrace apprenticeship. They're also going to influence the direction and shape and feel of apprenticeship for their particular industry. So I think it's a really exciting time for the apprenticeship system. It's definitely a time of change. I don't think we know today where the road will lead us, but it's an exciting time and certainly a time where we can see dramatically more Americans having apprenticeship opportunities than we've historically seen in the past.
Right, and I think we all can agree that it's good for both workers and employers. John, thanks for your leadership at the Department of Labor and all the work you all are doing every day to sort of help nurture and grow and support the apprenticeship system in the states and throughout the country. So just lastly, I'm going to give each one of you a few seconds just for any final thoughts before we wrap up this portion of the call. Thanks for participating. Karen, any final thoughts as we sign off on this portion of today's conversation?
Yes, I would again like to reiterate the tremendous opportunity employers and apprentices have utilizing the registered apprenticeship system with the portable credential, with the training beginning on day one, and more importantly, with the new partnerships that are being formed as it relates to build these new apprenticeship models, namely the technical college system or community college systems in states, and certainly the workforce system, more specifically the workforce development boards we have been partnering with over the last few years. Again, I'd like to thank you, Eric, for the opportunity and look forward to working with everyone in the future. Thank you.
Great, Karen. Great. Thank you. Greg, I want to thank you as a business person, as an employer, for taking your precious time to join us and contribute to the conversation today under the Act. Any final thoughts on the Apprenticeship Act or apprenticeship as it relates to OBERT, Greg?
I think just one real brief comment, Eric, for your audience. Labor shortages are pretty prevalent right now, and unfortunately, they're going to get worse. So if you do have a business or a company or you're participating in an industry, if you plan to have a future, you better have a program in place that will develop your own talent. It better be scalable, it better be agile, and it better be robust. If you don't have that, you're not going to have very much of a future. Apprenticeship is the best way to actually put that in place. So the registered apprenticeship system, I can truly say, Eric, without fear of contradiction, if we didn't have ours, OBERT would not exist.
Excellent, Greg. Thank you, and it certainly has served OBERT well for the years, and I appreciate your those comments and your contribution for today. And finally, John, any parting words? We've heard from the state, we've heard from an employer, now finally from you. Again, thank you for participating today. Any final words or recommendations to the field, John?
Sure. I would just echo Greg's comments there that this focus on apprenticeship is very much tied to the challenges and the labor shortage and skills gaps issues that we see across the country. This is ultimately about getting people jobs and meeting those demands for employers to fill those jobs that they're not able to fill today. So would just echo Greg's comments, and I encourage people to check back often here. I'll put in a shameless plug for our website and blogs and toolkits. There's lots of resources up there, and of course, our team and teams at the state level, such as Karen's staff, are always available to assist employers or anyone that wants to learn more about apprenticeship. So we have blogs, toolkits, all of that up there. And of course, please note that we'll be celebrating National Apprenticeship Week again this year, November 13th. So we really hope that people take advantage of that. It's a great opportunity to showcase what you're doing, to learn more about apprenticeship and tell the apprenticeship story. So November 13th, National Apprenticeship Week.
Thanks for joining us today. Appreciate you giving us the time. We're going to move to the next participant on our panel. Okay, so we're now joined by Dan Marshall. Dan's the Executive Director of AFL-CIO's Working for America Institute, headquarters here in Washington, D.C. Dan Marshall, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you to Jobs for the Future for putting together this panel and these very worthwhile activities focusing on our registered apprenticeship program here in the United States and helping to pull together various organizations and stakeholders to build on that registered apprenticeship system. The Working for America Institute has been around for a long time, for about 40 years now, and we've gone through various phases of working on groups of activities according to what's going on in the economy. Most recently, we have been working to expand the apprenticeship program, especially into some industries that are not ordinarily associated with apprenticeship, or industries that in the past have had very extensive apprenticeship programs, but those have been kind of scaled back over the years. I think the Fitzgerald Act and the beginning of a registered apprenticeship system is really kind of a particular United States approach to this. It really took a great deal of apprenticeship activities that were going on and institutionalized them, provided for a distinct role by the federal government, but also created a very American system in which we have a major role for both states and the federal government, and created a system that is designed in a way that is sustainable, that builds upon the commitment of employers to apprenticeship, and also integrates the voice of workers into the system through their unions. And here I would point to one particular part of the Fitzgerald Act, which says to bring together employers and labor for the formulation of programs of apprenticeship. So labor unions have really been built into the system from the beginning. And again, it's really unions that help to bring the voice of workers to the system and to guarantee the quality and the worker-centered nature of the training. The Fitzgerald Act and the various amendments and changes that have gone on really represent an excellent foundation for the apprenticeship system, and we hope to be involved in the future in activities that might modernize that system as well.
Well, that's great, Dan. Thanks for those observations, and I think you're right. You know, as we've been talking on this panel, the Act itself is not a very lengthy piece of legislation. I think it's about a page and a half with a few minor amendments to it. But in your reflections on the 80th anniversary, you know, clearly nobody has done a better job over the last 80 years than unions in figuring out how to work registered apprenticeships for the betterment of their industries, their employers, and their workers. And over the last few years, we've seen apprenticeship expand into new and emerging industries, not only in organized labor, but also outside of organized labor into other industries and other occupations. So more recently, as things have been changing and expanding in apprenticeship, how is the Act, or how is registered apprenticeship, how is it impacting the workforce landscape today, and what are some of your thoughts about where we are today, Dan?
Well, I think that the registered apprenticeship system really plays a very important role in where we are at right now in the United States. And when I say that, I mean that I think that there is a greater recognition throughout the economy and all kinds of different social groups that people need multiple career pathways to good jobs and to the middle class. Apprenticeship and registered apprenticeship in particular represent a kind of a touchstone there. We can look to the apprenticeship system, its combination of education and on-the-job learning as a very solid example of an alternative path to what Americans have really embraced over the last several generations of a four-year college education. Certainly, community colleges, post-secondary education play an important role in apprenticeship and registered apprenticeship programs, but we really need a route for different social groups to obtain the sort of skills and experience and job training that they need in order to, again, to attain that middle class and be able to really provide for their families. So if we can learn from the registered apprenticeship system, build upon it, figure out how to better integrate and coordinate career and technical education into a system, figure out how to systematically reach into the high schools and the middle schools and get out that message that there is an alternative career pathway to a four-year college education, I think we can really lay the basis for an economy that works for all.
Yeah. So, Dan, you made reference to this a couple of minutes ago, and you and I were in, I think it was Minnesota this winter with a few programs in the Midwest. Over the last 20 or 30 years, some in the manufacturing community have drifted away from apprenticeships. But now you're seeing a resurgence or a reinterest in some of those organizations in reestablishing apprenticeships?
Yes, I have. I mean, I've been in the employment and training field since the 1980s and the dislocated worker program in the state of Ohio. And this has really been the largest and most rapid increase of interest in work-based learning and apprenticeship that certainly I've seen in my career. And I think there are a couple of very important dynamics going on here. One is the retirement of the baby boom generation, persons like me who are going out the door, and unless organizations and employers have created systems to accommodate that change, the knowledge and skills and experience that baby boomers have are walking out of the door with them. And I think when employers look behind the kind of highly skilled and highly educated baby boom generation, they do not see a pipeline of skilled workers to take the place of these departing employees. And that's because that pipeline has basically been drained over the past 30 or 40 years. And I think that our economy is now suffering from that. So I think we're basically kind of casting about for ways that we can really develop, again, those alternatives, those multiple career pathways, and figure out how can we provide individuals with the education and training that they need at the same time as they're working, oftentimes, and they're bringing in that income for their families and their communities, and really create also a system in which they are able to upskill their skills and abilities as the economy changes, as organizations and employers confront technology and the impact of globalization, et cetera, et cetera. And again, apprenticeship represents a kind of foundation upon which to build. And in particular, of course, we and people generally realize that in the building and construction trades, we have the most high-quality apprenticeship programs that have been developed by unions jointly with their signatory employers, and we need to build upon that system in order to reach out and expand to other occupations and industries.
Sure. So, Dan, we only have about a minute left. So my last question to you, and I didn't say this, you did. You've been around for a while. You've been working with apprenticeships for a while. And as we reflect on the Fitzgerald Act, the National Apprenticeship Act, and in the future, you've already said, there's opportunities to expand for youth apprenticeships in the secondary school systems. But just in the minute we have left, if you could just reflect a little bit about opportunities for the future, and where do you think the apprenticeship system is headed in this country over the next few years?
I think the apprenticeship system is headed in a direction that will place greater focus on bringing in people from other populations that have been neglected or disadvantaged. I'm talking about ex-offenders, for example, people from disadvantaged communities. Apprenticeship needs to really reflect the diverse workforce that we have, the richness of the tremendous cultural experience in our country. And again, it needs to be flexible enough to really change as our workforce and economic and labor force conditions are changing. It needs to be able to change and adapt to take account of those new conditions.
Thank you so much, Dan. And that's Dan Marshall, the Executive Director of the Working for America Institute at the AFL-CIO. Thanks again, Dan, for your participation and your observations. So thank you. This has been an important conversation for today. On behalf of Jobs for the Future and the Center for Apprenticeship and Work-Based Learning, we'd like to thank everyone for participating. It's been an important conversation as we look at the last 80 years of apprenticeship and the National Apprenticeship Act of the United States. So that just about wraps up our conversation today. A few more program notes to come. But first, I want to thank Bob Lerman from the Urban Institute, Karen Morgan from the state of Wisconsin, Greg Chambers from Oberg Industries, Dan Marshall from Working for America Institute, and John Ladd from the Office of Apprenticeship at the Department of Labor. Thanks so much for joining us today and having this conversation. One important program note that I want folks to be aware of is please join JFF and many of our partners on November 9th in Washington, D.C. We'll be holding a celebration of apprenticeship and work-based learning. It will be a major event here in D.C. to recognize leaders and innovators in apprenticeship. And you can go to our website at jff.org and learn more about our November 9th celebration of apprenticeship. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for the interesting conversation. Please check out our website at the Center for Apprenticeship and Work-Based Learning at jff.org. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with many of you today. Hope to see you November 9th in Washington, D.C. And we look forward to these conversations to expand and advance apprenticeship across the country. Thank you. Today's conversation is sponsored by Jobs for the Future. JFF is a national nonprofit that builds educational and economic opportunity for underserved populations in the U.S. We develop innovative programs and policies that increase college readiness, career success, and build a more highly skilled workforce for the nation. We've been doing this for over 30 years, and we're a recognized leader in bridging education and work to increase economic mobility and strengthen our economy. JFF Center for Apprenticeship and Work-Based Learning was established in 2017 in June, and the center aims to bring together national resources, proven and promising practices, and technical assistance in one central place to support employers, workforce practitioners, and stakeholders of all kinds in developing successful apprenticeships and other work-based learning strategies.